The rain had been falling for 3 straight days, each drop a soft, persistent knock on the roof, as if nature itself were trying to get in. On the 4th morning, the knock became a roar. I was pouring coffee when I heard it, an eerie, low groan followed by a bone-deep crack. At first, I thought a tree had fallen. Then the ground trembled. Just slightly. Like a warning. I ran to the window and froze. The hill behind my house, once a gentle, grass-covered slope that children used to roll down during spring picnics, was collapsing before my eyes. Thick rivulets of brown mud tumbled down in slow, monstrous waves. A patch of rosemary I had planted years ago disappeared in seconds, swallowed whole. One of my retaining walls, a patchwork of redwood planks and concrete footers I'd installed myself, was gone. Or rather, it was now part of the landslide, a broken skeleton half submerged in the mud. The air smelled like wet earth and panic. The sound of the rain, so soothing just hours earlier, had turned sinister, like a metronome ticking down to something worse. I stepped outside in my slippers, the cold tile of the kitchen floor giving way to the wet slap of the patio stone. My eyes scanned the damage in disbelief. Trees lay like corpses, roots up. Fence posts tilted at impossible angles. The hillside that once cradled my backyard had become a monstrous wave of clay and debris, and it was still moving. And that was when it hit me, not just the horror of what was happening but the rage. 3 months ago, I had stood on that very slope, hands dirty, checking the supports on the retaining wall that had protected this property since before I moved in. I had emailed the HOA, called them, attended their monthly meeting in that dull beige clubhouse to plead with them not to remove it. But they had insisted. Said it was unauthorized. Said it disrupted the neighborhood's visual cohesion. One board member, Marcia, her name burned into my memory like a scar, had tilted her head and said, "It just doesn't fit the community aesthetic." Now mud was inching toward my foundation, and I wanted to drag Marcia right there and ask her if this fit the aesthetic better. That wall wasn't just wood and concrete, it was protection. It had held back decades of rainfall, absorbed the tremors of more than one minor earthquake, and had never once asked for recognition. But the HOA had seen it as an offense against their manicured utopia. In their eyes, my backyard was their canvas and my wall? A smudge. I wasn't the kind of person who made trouble. I paid my dues. I showed up to meetings when I had to. I waved at neighbors, shared tomatoes from my garden, kept my porch light warm and welcoming. I had built that barrier long before the current board took over, with proper drainage and structural integrity. It had permits on file, though apparently not in the format the new HOA management accepted. Bureaucracy had erased years of effort with one cold letter taped to my mailbox. Remove unapproved structure within 30 days or face escalating fines. Now, nature had delivered its verdict. And it wasn't subtle. The worst part wasn't just that they had torn it down. The worst part came later, after the storm had passed, after the hillside had spilled into my yard like a crime scene, after the emergency crews came and yellow-taped the area. It was when the HOA sent me another letter. It has come to our attention that the recent erosion event on your property may have been caused by inadequate landscaping maintenance and unauthorized modifications to the hillside terrain. I read it 3 times. They were blaming me. The people who had forced me to remove the one thing that had protected that hill were now pointing fingers, as if I had caused the landslide. As if I had invited the disaster with a shovel and a bad attitude. Standing there, soaked and shivering in my robe and slippers, ankle-deep in mud and disbelief, I could only laugh. A bitter, breathless laugh that echoed off the broken slope behind me. It was no longer about property or policy. This had become something else. A quiet war fought behind hedges and bylaws, with email chains and passive-aggressive letters as weapons. But now the damage was no longer metaphorical. The hill had literally collapsed, and I was going to make sure the truth didn't get buried with it. To understand how this all spiraled, you have to understand where I live, and who I live near. The neighborhood is called Hillside Crest, though the name feels more aspirational than descriptive. Nestled on the edge of a sleepy California suburb, it's a cluster of beige stucco homes with red tile roofs, spaced just far enough apart for privacy but close enough for judgment. It's the kind of place where people complain if your trash cans are out an hour too early, but they'll leave anonymous cookies at your door if your dog dies. Polite, pristine, and passive-aggressive, a homeowner's paradise so long as you follow the rules. I moved in 10 years ago just after my divorce. Bought the place at a good price because the slope in the backyard scared off a few buyers. But I loved it. The view stretched out over the valley, and in spring the hill would turn this deep, impossible green, speckled with wild mustard and poppies. I built a small vegetable garden near the base, added solar panels, and installed that retaining wall with a contractor friend of mine. Simple, strong, and essential. Over time, I made the house feel like mine. Safe, solid, home. I'm not flashy. I keep my lawn neat, my shutters painted, my garage closed. I know my neighbors by first name, but I'm not the type to organize block parties or start group chats about raccoons in the bins. Still, I've always contributed when asked. I've donated to holiday decorations, helped pressure wash sidewalks during cleanup drives, even volunteered for the annual tree trimming fund. You could call me a low-maintenance resident. The kind an HOA should love. But that's the thing about HOA boards, they don't love quiet compliance. They love control. Enter Marcia Walker, current president of the Hillside Crest HOA. Think of a well-dressed hawk in orthopedic sandals. Late 50s, always in coral lipstick, and capable of delivering an entire dressing down without raising her voice above a whisper. She has an uncanny memory for architectural guidelines and an almost religious devotion to uniformity. Her yard is a meditation on beige stones, beige mulch, beige succulents, and God help the neighbor whose flowers dare to bloom in purple. Marcia was elected president 2 years ago after the previous board stepped down en masse. Some say it was burnout. Others say Marcia orchestrated a quiet coup with her infamous 3-ring binder full of bylaw violations. Under her leadership, the HOA became precise, rigid. Letters started showing up on doorsteps like clockwork. Minor infractions were suddenly major issues. Overgrown hedges, festive lights still up in January, trash bins visible from the street. A few residents fought back. Most just sighed and complied. At first, I didn't think much of it. My house was in order. My wall, tucked behind my property and mostly hidden by native brush, had stood unbothered for years. I figured I was safe. Then came the inspection. An HOA routine assessment was announced via newsletter, claiming it would ensure slope stability and community harmony. But I suspected it was something else. Marcia's methodical sweep for anything that didn't fit her monochrome vision. I wasn't home when they came. I got an email with photos. Grainy close-ups of the wall. A PDF attachment labeled, Unapproved Modification to Rear Landscape. I replied immediately, explaining the wall's history. Attached old permit receipts. Cited the previous board's written acknowledgement of its existence. I got a form response in return. We appreciate your concern. The structure remains in violation of Article 4, Section 6B of the Hillside Crest Architectural Guidelines. It felt like arguing with a vending machine. No matter how reasonable my input, the output was always the same. What bothered me most wasn't just the board's rigidity, it was how my neighbors began to treat me after. Whispers during driveway chats. Awkward silences at the mailbox. I could feel myself becoming that homeowner, the difficult one, the troublemaker, the non-compliant. And it stung more than I expected. I wasn't trying to rebel. I wasn't trying to stand out. I just wanted to keep the hill from collapsing into my house. But in Hillside Crest, wanting to do things your way, even if it's the smart way, makes you dangerous. That wall was my line in the sand. And the HOA didn't like lines they didn't draw themselves. It started, as these things always do, with a letter. Cream-colored envelope. HOA logo in the top left corner. My name printed too formally, like they didn't quite know who I was despite my decade of residency. Inside was a neatly folded notice. 3 paragraphs, legal-sounding but unmistakably smug. This correspondence serves as formal notification that the retaining wall at the rear of your property is not in compliance with Hillside Crest community guidelines. Please remove the structure within 30 days to avoid further action, including fines and penalties as outlined in Article 4, Section 6B. I read it twice, thinking surely they meant someone else. Then I looked out the back window, saw my wall standing proud and solid as ever, and felt the slow churn of anger begin. I emailed the HOA board immediately, attaching documents and photos, copies of permits from 8 years ago, and a letter from the previous HOA secretary approving the structure, pending visual containment with native shrubbery. I pointed out that the wall wasn't visible from any common area or street, that it had been inspected, that it had never caused a single problem. They didn't care. A week later I got a response, this time from Marcia directly. We appreciate your engagement. However, historical approvals by former boards do not override current standards of uniformity and environmental impact mitigation. The structure must be removed. I stared at her words, my jaw tight. Uniformity? Environmental impact? The wall was literally preventing an environmental disaster. But logic had no foothold here. It wasn't about erosion or safety. It was about power. About someone like Marcia getting to play sheriff in a neighborhood made of stucco and overwatered lawns. Still, I tried reason. I called. I left a voicemail explaining the function of the wall, how it had held the slope through 5 storm seasons, how removing it could destabilize the soil. No reply. Instead, a new notice appeared, this one printed in red ink. Final warning, non-compliance will result in $100 per day fine. That was the moment I stopped trying to be polite. I went to the next HOA meeting. I sat in one of those wobbly plastic chairs in the rec room, surrounded by neighbors pretending not to glance at me. When they opened the floor for resident concerns, I stood up. Calm voice, controlled tone. I'm here about the retaining wall, I said. You're asking me to remove a safety structure that's been here for nearly a decade. It has permits. It's not visible from any public space. And removing it could put my property, and possibly others, at risk. Marcia didn't even flinch. She smiled that thin managerial smile and said, the rules apply to everyone equally. But they're being applied retroactively, I said, my voice rising despite myself. This wall was built under a previous board, and it has served a critical function. I'm not asking to build something new, I'm asking to keep what's already proven effective. There was a pause. A few board members exchanged glances. One younger guy, Jake, looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't. Marcia just adjusted her clipboard. If we make exceptions, she said, we lose consistency. That's what keeps this community desirable. Desirable. The word felt like a slap. What did desirability have to do with a hidden wall that kept the hill from collapsing? I left the meeting feeling humiliated. But more than that, I felt afraid. The wall wasn't just some backyard project, it was structural protection. Without it, the slope would be exposed to runoff, erosion, and gravity. And I knew the soil well enough to understand that it didn't take much to turn a hill into a hazard. That night, I sat on my patio with a flashlight inspecting the beams. I ran my hands along the wood, still sturdy despite the weather. I thought about all the weekends I'd spent maintaining it, the hours spent measuring slope angles and digging drainage lines. I had done everything right. And now, because it didn't fit some arbitrary vision of curb appeal, it was condemned. The emotional weight of it all began to settle in. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept spinning with what ifs. What if I refused to remove it? What if they started fining me into bankruptcy? What if, God forbid, I took it down and the hill gave way? That's when the anxiety really set in. Not just fear for my property but something deeper. A sense of helplessness. That people who barely knew me, who never stepped foot in my yard, had the power to undermine everything I had built, literally and figuratively. And yet the clock was ticking. 30 days. The HOA had drawn their line. And they expected me to cave. What they didn't know was, I don't cave easily. By the second week of my non-compliance, the letters started arriving daily. First came the fines. A neatly typed invoice stapled to a printed photo of my retaining wall. Same image every time, like a mugshot. $100 per day, retroactive to date of notice. The total climbed with each passing sunrise. Then came the reminders. Then the escalation warnings. By day 10, the envelope was marked urgent in bold red ink, the kind usually reserved for hospital bills or jury summons. It was all so theatrical, so absurdly aggressive, I almost laughed, except that I was terrified. It was no longer about the wall. It was about leverage, power, control. I tried again to explain, to reason. I printed every permit I had. I highlighted dates, signatures, slope specifications. I included photos of the wall from the day it was built and from just last month, showing its stability. I even included a topographic map from the original property survey that showed the incline's risk level. I handed the whole packet over to Jake, the younger board member who had looked uneasy at the last meeting. He nodded, promised to bring it to the next review session. But a few days later, I received a new letter. Not from the HOA this time, from their attorney. As legal counsel for Hillside Crest Homeowners Association, I am writing to formally notify you that your failure to comply with community structural guidelines constitutes a breach of your covenant agreement. Legal proceedings may be pursued if corrective action is not taken within 7 business days. They were threatening to sue me. My hands trembled as I read it. 7 days. That's all I had. It didn't matter that I had documentation. It didn't matter that the wall was safe, necessary, and backed by common sense. They had the bylaws. They had signatures. They had a paper fortress built of outdated rules, and they were prepared to bury me under it. I started losing sleep again. Waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I'd hear the slope groaning outside. Every gust of wind made me flinch. I imagined the hill giving way not because of nature but because I'd been forced to unbolt the one thing holding it back. The idea of taking it down felt like playing Russian roulette with my own house. But it wasn't just fear anymore, it was anger. I was furious. I posted in the private Hillside Crest Facebook group, a space usually reserved for lost pets and garage sales. I kept it calm, factual, polite. Hi neighbors. I wanted to share some details about the retaining wall issue on my property, which some of you may have heard about. The wall was installed nearly a decade ago with proper permitting and has prevented slope erosion during multiple storms. The HOA is now demanding its removal, despite the risk it poses to my property and potentially others nearby. I'd appreciate support or even just dialogue, as this affects the long-term safety of our community. The post got over 40 comments in a day. Some offered sympathy. Others were cautious but curious. A few residents admitted to having their own quiet frustrations with Marcia's reign, being fined for flower colors, or forced to repaint fences that didn't match HOA preferred shades. One neighbor, an engineer, DM'd me offering to review the wall structure. Another couple mentioned a similar incident involving a drought-resistant garden that had been ripped out because it clashed with community themes. Still, not everyone was on my side. A few comments came from clear loyalists, people who practically quoted the bylaws verbatim, praising Marcia's dedication to community standards. One woman even suggested I was trying to stir up division for personal gain. I wasn't surprised. In Hillside Crest, rebellion, no matter how rational, was bad manners. The next HOA meeting was tense. I walked in and felt every eye on me. Marcia didn't even look up when I sat down. She launched into her standard agenda: trash bin reminders, pet leash citations, fence paint guidelines. When the open forum finally arrived, I stood up again. This time I brought a folder, copies of all my documentation neatly organized. I've consulted with a geotechnical engineer, I began. He agrees. Removing the retaining wall would destabilize the slope, increase erosion, and could pose a threat not only to my home but to adjacent properties. I am willing to submit a formal report at the board's request. Marcia cut me off before I finished. We are not here to relitigate individual cases in open session, she said, her voice smooth, polished. This matter is under legal review. Please submit any further communication through appropriate channels. And just like that, the room moved on. From landslides to landscaping tips. I sat down, humiliated but burning. They didn't want solutions. They wanted silence. Compliance. I was a problem, and problems had to be paved over, preferably with beige gravel. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't backing down. I had something they didn't: the truth, and the growing suspicion of an entire neighborhood that maybe, just maybe, the board wasn't always right. The tipping point came not in a meeting or a letter, but in the middle of the night, 2:43 a.m. to be exact, when a low rumble outside jolted me awake. Not thunder. Not a car. Something deeper. I threw on a jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out onto my back deck. There, beneath the moonlight, I saw it. A shallow gouge in the slope, fresh dirt spilled like blood over my mulch. Nothing catastrophic but unmistakable, a small landslide. The rain the night before had been light, barely more than drizzle. And yet, the hill had already begun to shift. That was my aha moment. They wanted to play legal games? Fine. I'd play by a different rulebook: science, logic, and public accountability. The next morning I called the geotechnical engineer again, the one who'd offered a second opinion, and hired him for a full site inspection. I also reached out to a local environmental law clinic at the nearby university. Turns out, California takes slope protection very seriously, especially in residential zones built along former wildland ridges. One of their faculty advisors agreed to help me draft a formal hazard report. Better yet, she had students eager to take on real-life land-use conflicts for course credit. By the end of the week, I had a professional risk assessment, annotated maps, photos of the post-rain soil slippage, and a letter stating that removal of the retaining wall will substantially increase the likelihood of erosion, surface runoff destabilization, and potential loss of structural integrity for properties directly downhill. It was essentially the expert version of, "Are you out of your minds?" But I wasn't finished. I gathered every HOA letter, email, and violation notice I'd received, along with timestamps, fine schedules, and copies of my responses. I laid it all out, chronological, indexed, color-coded. Then I posted it online. Not in the private Hillside Crest group this time, but in a public homeowners forum for California residents, one that specialized in HOA overreach and legal defense. The response was immediate and furious. Messages flooded in. Stories from across the state. People fined for wind chimes. Threatened for planting fruit trees. Sued for installing solar panels. It wasn't just me. I was part of something bigger. A quiet war playing out in neighborhoods behind perfectly trimmed hedges and painted fences. One attorney even offered to review my case pro bono. "These types of boards thrive on isolation and fear," she wrote. "You're doing the right thing by shining a light." So I turned on the floodlights. I printed out the geotechnical report and hand-delivered it to every single board member's home. No envelopes. Just a binder with a bright red cover that said, "Imminent risk, do not remove this wall." I emailed it to the city's code enforcement office, the county land use department, and the HOA's own insurance carrier. I attached a note. "Please be advised, I have formally notified the HOA of the potential liability they may assume by forcing the removal of a structural barrier essential to slope stability. A copy of this report has been distributed to relevant public agencies. In the event of property damage or injury resulting from erosion, this correspondence will serve as prior warning and legal documentation of negligence." Within 48 hours the tone changed. Jake from the board called me, nervous, almost apologetic. "Some of the other members, we didn't fully understand the implications," he said. "Can we meet to discuss a possible compromise?" I said no. No more compromises. I wanted a written retraction. A formal acknowledgement that the wall was necessary. And a commitment to review outdated guidelines to prevent future harassment. By the end of the week, the daily fines stopped. A new letter arrived. This one much thinner, printed in plain black ink. "After further review, the HOA has determined that the retaining wall on your property does not pose a visual or structural violation of current community standards. No further action is required. No apology. No admission of error." But the threat was gone. And in its place, the quiet hum of retreat. The HOA had blinked. And I finally exhaled. I didn't throw a party, but it felt like I should have. The day the HOA officially backed off, I stood in my backyard, staring at the retaining wall like it was an old friend who just survived a war. I ran my hand along the wood, still solid, still strong. It had held its ground. And so had I. But it wasn't enough to just win. Not after what they'd put me through, the legal threats, the fines, the cold silencing tactics. I wanted a reckoning. And slowly, it began to arrive, not in one dramatic explosion, but in small, poetic moments of consequence. First came the whispers. Neighbors started approaching me on their evening walks. Quiet conversations on sidewalks, by mailboxes, over garden fences. "I saw your post, thank you for speaking up. Marcia tried to fine us for our porch light bulbs last year. We didn't fight back. We should have. Your wall saved more than your yard, you know. If that slope goes, half this block's in trouble." It turns out I wasn't alone. I'd just been the first to say the quiet part out loud. Then came the cracks in the facade. At the next HOA meeting, the room looked different. More full. More tense. A few people brought printed agendas. One neighbor had highlighted bylaws. There were questions, real ones. Why were certain fines issued without warning? Why weren't structural reviews made public? Why was Marcia acting as both board chair and enforcement liaison, when the bylaws suggested those roles should be separated? Marcia tried to hold her ground, clipboard in hand, voice steady, but something had shifted. Her answers stumbled. The usual smug confidence was fraying. And then someone asked the question that made the entire room sit up. Did the HOA notify its insurance provider before attempting to enforce the removal of a documented safety structure? Silence. A blink. Then Marcia muttered something about internal process reviews. But the damage was done. She'd shown her hand, and everyone saw the tremble in it. It didn't stop there. The local paper ran a feature titled, "When HOA Power Goes Too Far," and while it didn't mention names, the details were unmistakable. A hillside home, a retaining wall, a threatened lawsuit, a community rising up. The article included quotes from a land use professor, my university contact, and even a sidebar with tips for fighting HOA overreach. It spread fast. By then, the Facebook group had turned into a battleground. Residents who'd once kept their heads down were now openly posting about questionable enforcements. Someone dug up board meeting minutes from 5 years ago and found contradictions in how certain rules had been applied to different homeowners. Another resident started a petition to introduce term limits and board rotation policies. And then, sweetest of all, Marcia resigned. The email was short, sterile, probably written through gritted teeth. Due to personal obligations and shifting priorities, I have decided to step down from my role as HOA board chair effective immediately. No one cheered publicly, of course. That wasn't the Hillside Crest way. But my inbox lit up with emojis, party popper, clapping hands, raising hands, and one simple message that made me laugh out loud. The wall stood. She didn't. As for me, I kept every piece of documentation. I even made a digital folder labeled HOA Shenanigans for future use. But I didn't need to use it again. Instead, I did something unexpected. I applied for the open board seat. People were surprised, maybe even a little wary. But I made my case. I wasn't there to pick fights. I was there to restore balance. To remind the board that its job was to serve the community, not control it. That safety wasn't negotiable. That rules mattered, but so did reason. I was elected in a 17-12 vote. At my first meeting as a board member, I brought in a motion to review and revise all structural guidelines based on up-to-date engineering standards and environmental data. It passed. I also requested that the board implement a transparent appeal process, with third-party mediation for future disputes. That passed too barely. Change, like erosion, happens slowly. But it happens. And every time I look out at that wall, still standing, still holding back the hillside, I remember that sometimes the only way to keep the ground beneath you from collapsing is to plant your feet and refuse to move. It's been 6 months since the last letter, and the silence is the sweetest sound I've heard. The fines never resumed. The legal threats disappeared like they'd never existed. And the wall? It stands stronger than ever, rebuilt at its base with reinforced footing, thanks to a neighbor who volunteered to help. He's an architect, apparently. Said it was the least he could do. Since the fallout, Hillside Crest feels different. Not drastically, no one suddenly started hosting block parties or staging revolutions, but there's a shift in the air, a subtle unraveling of the fear that once kept us quiet. The Facebook group now sees weekly posts questioning policies, suggesting new landscaping exemptions, and, imagine this, offering praise when someone adds solar panels or a pollinator garden. I see more front doors painted in color now. Soft greens, rich blues. Someone even put up wind chimes. We're not a rebellious community by nature, but we've learned to raise our voices, not to be loud but to be heard. The HOA board now operates with actual transparency. We publish our meeting minutes within 48 hours. We post pending policy changes online for community feedback. There's a suggestion box at the community center, and at our last meeting, a resident submitted an idea for a neighbor safety task force to identify slopes, trees, fences, or drains that could pose hazards in bad weather. We approved it unanimously. Sometimes I still think about that first notice. The arrogance of it. The assumption that rules, however outdated, mattered more than logic, more than safety, more than human decency. But I also think about what came after, that once I stopped being afraid, I stopped being alone. I used to believe HOAs were untouchable. Bureaucracies cloaked in politeness, impossible to challenge without losing your mind or your home. But now I know, even the most rigid systems can crack. Especially when they're built on nothing but authority for its own sake. The real victory wasn't just keeping my wall. It was watching people remember that the board serves us, not the other way around. And maybe more than anything, I've learned this: there's power in the quiet fight. Not everything needs a shouting match. Sometimes all it takes is a red binder, a few neighbors, and the courage to say, no, that's not right. Marcia moved out 2 months ago. Sold her house to a young couple with a golden retriever and a cactus garden in brightly painted pots. No one said much when the for sale sign came down, but I heard a few neighbors call it a reset. I still serve on the board. I still walk my property after heavy rains. And every time I pass the retaining wall, I pause, not just to check for erosion but to remind myself that this is what standing your ground looks like. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I'm sipping coffee on the deck and the hillside is still and green and quiet, I smile. Because the wall didn't just hold back the earth. Changed everything.